There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a dinner table when somebody finally says a number out loud. Not a shout, not an accusation, just a number, spoken plainly over the mashed potatoes. $61,400. My name is Adele Whitlock. I am 39 years old, and it took me 11 years to say that number to my own father. For 11 years, I paid my brother's rent because my father asked me to, 1 month at a time. Nobody ever asked me if I was okay, and nobody ever said thank you, and nobody ever called it what it was. This is the story of the night I stopped paying, and what it cost me to hold that line, and what happened to my family when the money finally ran out. There is no lawyer in this story, no dramatic twist, no stranger walking in at the perfect moment to save me. There is just a woman with a spreadsheet, a 7-year-old with an honest question, and 2 short letters that changed everything. Let me take you back to where it started. Before I do, if you're new here, do me a small favor. Hit that like button, subscribe if stories like this one mean something to you, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one, and honestly, seeing a comment from a kitchen in Ohio at midnight or a car in Perth at lunchtime reminds me why I tell these stories out loud. All right, back to the beginning. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, in a brick ranch house with a carport and a fig tree that my mother, Louise, refused to let anyone prune. My father, Sherman, worked 30 years as a parts manager at a dealership off University Drive. My mother ran the house, and I mean she ran it, the way a good air traffic controller runs a tower. Birthdays never got missed. Casseroles appeared on the porches of sick neighbors within hours. My mother kept a calendar on the kitchen wall, with everyone's appointments in 4 different colors of ink, and when I picture her now, I picture her standing at that calendar with a pen cap in her teeth. She was the load-bearing wall of our family. We just didn't know it yet, because you never know which wall is load-bearing until somebody knocks it down. My brother Dean is 4 years younger than me. Growing up, Dean was the fun one, and I want to be fair about that, because he really was fun. He could make my mother laugh until she had to set down whatever she was holding. He was the kid who organized the neighborhood kickball games, the teenager who could talk his way out of a speeding ticket, the young man everyone assumed would land on his feet because he always had. I was the other one. I was the kid who alphabetized her books, who kept receipts for her allowance purchases in a shoebox, who reminded my parents when the car registration was due. I could tell you, at 11 years old, exactly how many weeks of babysitting money it would take to buy a new bike, down to the dollar. Nobody assigned us these roles at a family meeting. They just settled onto us, the way dust settles, evenly and without anyone's permission. I say all this so you understand that when I tell you I became a medical billing specialist, it will not surprise you. I itemize things for a living. All day long, I take the chaos of what happens to a human body in a hospital, and I turn it into line items, codes, and totals. I find the errors nobody else catches. I know, down to the decimal, what things actually cost. Hold on to that detail, because it matters later. It matters more than anything else in this story. My mother died 12 years ago, in the fall, of an aggressive ovarian cancer that went from diagnosis to funeral in 19 weeks. I was 27. Dean was 23. My father was 55 years old and had never once, in 32 years of marriage, made his own dentist appointment. I don't say that to mock him. I say it because it's the plain truth of what my mother's death did to our family. The tower lost its controller. Every plane in the sky suddenly had to figure out where to land on its own. Except they didn't figure it out on their own. They landed on me. Within a month of the funeral, I was the one keeping the calendar. I ordered the headstone because Dad couldn't bring himself to look at the catalog, and I understood that I truly did. I sorted my mother's closet because Dean said he couldn't be in that room without falling apart. I hosted the first Thanksgiving 11 weeks after we buried her because somebody had to, and everyone looked at me. I remember standing in my kitchen at 6 in the morning with my mother's handwritten stuffing recipe, crying so hard I couldn't read her cursive, and then wiping my face and preheating the oven anyway. Nobody saw that part. That's the thing about being the responsible one. The work is only visible when it doesn't get done. About 10 months after Mom died, Dean's life came apart. He lost his warehouse job in a round of layoffs, and 3 weeks later his girlfriend of 4 years moved out and took the dog and half the furniture. Dean was living in a one-bedroom apartment on the south side of town, and the rent was $650 a month. Suddenly, he had no income and no cushion, because Dean had never in his life kept a cushion. He was 24 and hollowed out, and I felt for him. I want to be honest about that. My little brother was hurting, in a year when we were all hurting, and helping him did not feel like a burden at first. It felt like the only thing that made sense. But here's the detail I need you to notice. Dean never asked me for money. Not once, not then, not ever, actually, in 11 years. My father asked. Sherman called me on a Tuesday evening in the spring, 11 years ago now, and I remember I was standing at my stove stirring a pot of chili when the phone rang. He talked about Dean for a while, about how worried he was, about how a man losing his job and his girl in the same month can go to a dark place. And then he said it. He asked if I could cover Dean's rent, just for a few months, until he's back on his feet. And when I hesitated, not because I planned to say no, but just because I was doing math in my head. My father filled that 2-second pause with a sentence I would hear in my sleep for the next decade. He said, word for word, "Your mother would want us to take care of each other." What do you say to that? 10 months after the funeral, with her recipe cards still in my kitchen drawer, what does anyone say to that? I said yes. Of course I said yes. I was 28, newly married to Desmond, and we were doing okay, not rich but okay, and it was a few months, and it was my brother, and it was what my mother would want. I set up the payment that night before I went to bed, because that's who I am. $650 on the first of every month, straight to Dean's landlord. I even felt good about it. I remember telling Desmond it was the first thing since the funeral that felt like doing something instead of just grieving. So let me tell you what a few months looks like when nobody ever revisits it. Month 4 came and went, and Dean had found part-time work at an auto parts store. But part-time doesn't cover rent, so I kept paying, and that made sense. Month 9, Dean was full-time but behind on a credit card, and Dad said let's not pull the rug out just when he's stabilizing, and that made sense too. Every single month in isolation made sense. That's the trap. Nobody ever asks you to sign up for 11 years. They ask you for one more reasonable month, 132 times in a row. Somewhere around the 2-year mark, the arrangement stopped being a topic at all. It just became weather. It became a fact about our family, like the fig tree, like Dad's recliner. The payment went out on the first of the month the way the sun came up. Dean would thank me at Christmas, in the early years, a quick side hug and a mumbled thanks for everything. Dell then even that faded, not out of malice, I think, but out of the simple human talent for getting used to things. My father never thanked me at all. In his mind, I have come to understand, there was nothing to thank me for. I wasn't doing him a favor. I was performing a role, the role my mother's death had assigned me, and you don't thank the wall for holding up the roof. Meanwhile, my own life kept moving. Desmond and I bought a small house in southeast Huntsville, 3 bedrooms, a slab of cracked patio out back that we kept meaning to fix. I got promoted twice at the hospital billing office. And 8 years ago, our daughter was born, Ren. I want to tell you that becoming a mother snapped me awake about the money, but it didn't, not right away. What it did was quieter. It started a clock ticking somewhere in the back of my mind, a clock I wouldn't consciously hear for years. Here is what changed. For the first time, the money going out the door every month had somewhere else it was supposed to be. The rent went up over the years, the way rent does. $650 became $700, then $740. When Dean moved to a slightly nicer complex about 6 years in, it became $825. And it was that move, that new apartment, that brought the second thing I need to tell you about. The thing that, looking back, should have been my line in the sand, and wasn't. It was a Thursday in October, 5 or 6 years into the arrangement, and I was standing at my mailbox after work, flipping through the usual stack of junk. And there, between a grocery flyer and a credit card offer, was an envelope from Crestline Property Management, addressed to me. Not to Dean. To me, Adele Whitlock, at my home address. Inside was a lease renewal notice for Dean's apartment. It listed the new monthly rent and the renewal deadline, and there, in the paragraph about parties to the lease, was my name. Guarantor, Adele R. Whitlock. I stood in my driveway and read that word 4 times. Guarantor. I am a person who reads contracts for fun, and I had never seen this lease, and I had certainly never signed. Except I had. It took me 2 days of phone calls and one very uncomfortable conversation to piece it together. When Dean applied for that apartment, his income alone didn't qualify. So my father had brought him my information, and there had been a form. At some point during that busy season, Dad had put papers in front of me at his kitchen table, the way he'd done a dozen times with insurance documents and utility changes after Mom died. He'd said something like, "This just says you help Dean with rent. They need it for the application." And I signed because I was his daughter, and because 6 years of being the family's administrator had trained me, by then, to sign whatever kept the machine running. I didn't read it. Me. The woman who reads everything, and I didn't read it, because it came from my father's hand at my mother's kitchen table. What I had actually signed made me legally responsible for the entire lease. If Dean missed a month, they would come to me. If he broke the lease, damaged the unit, walked away, the debt was mine. My exposure wasn't $825 a month. It was the full value of a 12-month lease, renewed year after year, hanging over my house, my credit, my daughter's college fund. And nobody had sat me down and asked. I had been volunteered, quietly, the way you'd volunteer a ladder from your own garage. I did confront my father about it, if you can call it that. I called him and I kept my voice level and I said, "Dad, I didn't know I was guaranteeing the whole lease. You should have explained that to me." And I will never forget how gently he brushed it off. He said, "Honey, it's a formality. Dean's never missed a month, has he?" Which was true, because I was the reason he'd never missed a month. The circle was perfect and my father could not see it, or would not. Then he changed the subject to Wren's Halloween costume, and I let him, and that was that. I told Desmond about it that night, and my husband looked at me for a long moment and said, very quietly, "One day you're going to have to be the one who ends this, because they never will." I remember being annoyed at him for saying it. Not because he was wrong, because he was right, and I wasn't ready. So the years kept passing, and I'll pass them quickly here the way they passed slowly there. Wren started kindergarten. Desmond's mother had a knee replaced, and we helped with that gladly. The rent hit $875. And alongside the rent, there was a steady drizzle of what I came to call the just this once money. Dean's transmission, $900 just this once. First and last month when he moved, $850 just this once, and yes, I was still paying monthly on top of that. A moving truck, $400. His phone bill caught up twice, $190 here, $210 there. A security deposit on a storage unit he needed for exactly one summer and never emptied, so that 11 months later there was a second, smaller just this once, to finally close it out. A dental crown, $600, because his plan through the auto parts store had a waiting period, and nobody had read the fine print on it. Every one of these calls came on a weeknight, always after dinner, always in that same unhurried voice, the voice of a man reading you the weather off a card. I got so I could feel one coming, before I even answered, some small change in the air, the way you can feel a storm 2 counties off, before the sky does anything about it. None of it dramatic. All of it always rooted through my father. Dad would call, lay out the situation in his patient parts manager voice, and somewhere in the call, if I paused too long, my mother would enter the conversation. What she would have wanted. How she'd held this family together. How we were all he and Dean had left of her. I want you to understand how ordinary all of it felt while it was happening, because that's the part people never quite believe afterward. There was no single terrible night in those years. There was only a very long string of perfectly reasonable Tuesdays, each one small enough to say yes to, none of them ever added up out loud. My mother worked harder in the 11 years after her death than most people work in a lifetime. My father made sure of it. Now I need to tell you about the dinner. Not the last dinner, the one I opened this story with. The one before it, a year earlier. The one where I tried, for the first and only time, to raise the subject out loud, and got taught exactly what would happen to me if I ever tried again. It was a Sunday in early summer, a year and a couple of months before the end of this story. We were at my father's house, the brick ranch, around the same oak table I'd eaten at my whole life. Present were my father, Dean, me and Desmond, Wren coloring in the living room, my Aunt Charlene, who is my mother's younger sister, and Charlene's husband, Walt. pot roast, sweet tea, the good tablecloth. And I had decided going in that I would say something small, not an ultimatum, barely even a request. I had rehearsed it in the car until Desmond reached over and squeezed my hand at a red light. There was a lull while the peach cobbler was being passed, and I took a breath, and I said something very close to this. Dad, Dean, I've been thinking, it's been a lot of years now with the rent, and Wren's getting older. Desmond and I need to start tightening up, so I'd like us to talk about a plan for winding it down. Maybe over the next year. Nothing sudden. That was it. That was the whole grenade. I said it in the same tone you'd use to suggest moving Thanksgiving to a different weekend. The table went quiet, and Dean looked down at his plate, and his ears went red, and he said nothing. And my father set down the cobbler's spoon, and he took off his glasses, and he folded them, which I knew from childhood was the overture to a speech. And then Sherman Whitlock did the thing he does better than any man I've ever met. He got sad at me. Not angry. Sad. Anger you can argue with. He looked at me with an expression of profound, wounded disappointment, and he said, "Well, I didn't realize helping your brother had become such a burden to you." He said, "Your mother must be so glad she's not here for this." He said that at that table in front of her sister. He said, "I lie awake at night, trying to keep this family from scattering to the four winds, and I ask one thing, and this is what it comes to: money." He turned to Aunt Charlene and said, "Louise never once counted a dollar she spent on these kids," and shook his head and put his glasses back on, which meant the speech was over and the verdict was in. And here's the part that still makes my face go hot when I think about it. It worked. Aunt Charlene looked at me with this small, pained, oh honey look. Walt studied his cobbler like it contained a message. Dean, my grown brother, whose rent was the subject on the table, said nothing at all, not one word, not in my defense and not in his own. And I heard myself apologize. I actually said, "No, Dad, of course, forget I brought it up. I just meant," and then I trailed off and passed the cobbler and asked Charlene about her tomatoes. 20 minutes later, I was washing dishes at my mother's sink, and I could hear my father in the den, laughing at something on the television, completely restored. I stood there with my hands in the hot water, feeling like I had done something shameful and gotten away with it only by the family's mercy. Desmond was furious on the drive home, in his contained way, both hands tight on the wheel. He said, "You know what that was, right? That was a public execution, done politely." And I defended my father. That's the part I want you to sit with, because if you've lived anything like this story, you already know it. I defended him. I said he's old, he misses Mom, he doesn't mean it like that. It took me another full year to understand that whether he means it like that is entirely beside the point. A trap doesn't have to be malicious to hold you. It just has to be shaped exactly like your guilt. But something did change after that dinner, even though nobody could see it. A door I couldn't unlock yet had at least shown me where it was. And in the strange, quiet year that followed, I did the only thing I have ever known how to do when the world stops making sense. I itemized. It started almost by accident. One night that August I couldn't sleep, and I was up at the kitchen table with my laptop, and instead of scrolling, I opened a spreadsheet. Force of habit, honestly, a billing specialist's version of pacing the floor. And I typed a header into the first cell. I typed Dean, and then I deleted it and typed instead what I have paid. And then, over about 4 months, in stolen half hours, I reconstructed 11 years. I am very good at this. It is literally my profession. I pulled bank statements back a decade. I found the old transfer records to the first landlord, $650 a month for 31 months. The bump to $700, then $740. The Crestline years at $825, then $875. I found the transmission, the deposits, the moving truck, the phone bills, a bailout for an overdrawn account I'd forgotten entirely, $300 in year 4. I found the storage unit, and the crown, and $110 for a broken windshield in year 9. I had completely lost track of that one until the bank records surfaced it again, cold, in a column of numbers. I coded each line the way I code claims, date, amount, category, and a column I labeled, asked by. And in 11 years of rows, that column said Sherman on every single line but 2. Some nights, working through it, it was almost peaceful, the same quiet focus I get from a stack of hospital claims that don't add up yet. Other nights it wasn't peaceful at all. I remember one Tuesday in October, Desmond already asleep, the house so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycle on. I hit the row for the storage unit and had to get up and stand at the sink for a minute before I could keep going. I hadn't remembered until that exact second how frightened I'd been that particular month, how close we'd come to dipping into Wren's college fund to cover it, without ever telling my father no. The spreadsheet didn't just total the money. It handed me back years I had half forgotten living through, one row at a time, and some of those years I did not especially want returned to me. I kept going anyway. That's the only kind of accounting that ever actually tells you the truth, the kind you don't stop halfway through because it's gotten uncomfortable. The rent alone came to $58,080. The just this once money came to $3,320. Total, $61,400. I sat and looked at that number for a long time on a cold night in December, with the house asleep around me. 61,400. It was more than we had paid for both our cars. It was within shouting distance of what we owed on the mortgage principal at the time. It was, I calculated, because of course I calculated, roughly $465 every single month for 132 consecutive months. And in all that time, there was not one written agreement, one review, or one conversation that I had been permitted to finish. I want to be very clear about what that spreadsheet was and was not, because this matters to me. It was not ammunition. I was not building a case to slap down on my father's table, and in fact, no one but Desmond ever saw it. I did not need to win an argument. I needed something much sadder and much simpler than that. I needed to know that I wasn't crazy. 11 years of being told, in 100 gentle ways, that this was normal, that this was small, that only a cold woman would count it, had genuinely made me unable to trust my own sense of scale. The spreadsheet was me, asking the one language I trust completely, and the language answering plainly. It was not small. It had never been small. $61,400 is not a favor. It is a second mortgage with no house attached. And still I didn't stop. I want to be honest about that too. I finished the spreadsheet in December, and I kept paying January, February, March, April. Knowing the number turned out not to be the same thing as being ready. I would look at the total and feel the truth of it, and then the first of the month would come, and I would picture my father folding his glasses and my aunt's oh honey face, and I would pay. Clarity and courage, it turns out, are two different muscles. I had built one in secret at my kitchen table. The other one was built for me by a 7-year-old on an ordinary Tuesday in May. Wren and I were doing her reading homework at the kitchen table. Desmond was at the stove. And on the counter, my open laptop showed the bank's payment confirmation screen because the first of the month had been that week. Wren, who is at the age where children read everything out loud, like the world is one big cereal box, read the payee name off the screen. Crestline Property Management. And she asked what that was, and I said, without thinking, that's Uncle Dean's apartment, sweetheart. And Wren frowned the small frown she uses on things that don't add up, and she asked, in the most unweighted, unwounded, purely curious voice you can imagine, why do we pay for Uncle Dean's house? He's a grown-up. Desmond went very still at the stove. And I opened my mouth, and I want you to understand, I am a person with an answer for everything. I answer questions about incomprehensible bills for a living, and I had nothing. Because every answer I reached for came out of my hand as dust. Because Grandpa asked me to. Because it's what Grandma would have wanted. Because it started when you weren't born yet and no one ever stopped it. I stood there in front of my daughter, 132 payments deep. And I realized, right then, that there was no version of the answer I could say out loud to a 7-year-old without hearing, in my own voice, exactly how wrong it was. Children are auditors. They walk into the middle of your life with no context and read the actual numbers off the actual screen. I said something like, "That's a good question, baby. Grown-ups sometimes help each other," and I closed the laptop, and we finished her reading. And that night, after she was asleep, I sat down across from Desmond and I said, "I'm done." And my husband, who had waited 11 years and never once said "I told you so," just nodded and reached across the table and held my hand and said, "Okay. How do you want to do it?" And that question, "How do you want to do it?" was the first time in this entire story that anyone had treated the arrangement as something I got to decide. The first time in 11 years. It came from my husband, and it only came because I had finally said the words out loud. Here's where I want to pause and ask you something, because I've wondered about it every day since. Be honest with me in the comments. Have you ever needed a child, or a stranger, or someone completely outside the walls to say the obvious thing before you could see it? Because I keep asking myself why my daughter could see, in 9 seconds, what I couldn't act on in 11 years. I think the answer is that she was the only person in Wren's life who had never been handed a role in the play. Tell me yours. I read everything. All right, deep breath, because we're at the part of the story where I finally say the number out loud. I did not plan an ambush, and I did not want a scene, so I did what the precise, organized, itemizing woman in this story was always going to do. I wrote letters. 2 of them, both drafted on a Sunday morning in June at my kitchen table, both boring on purpose. The first went to Crestline Property Management, certified mail. 3 paragraphs. It said that I, Adele Whitlock, currently listed as guarantor on the lease for Dean's unit, was providing written notice that I would not be renewing my guarantee. Effective the lease renewal date of September 30th, I was to be removed from the lease and all associated obligations. I quoted the lease clause that permitted this at renewal because I had read this contract now. Believe me, I had read it the way Scripture gets read. I requested written confirmation. 15 sentences, no adjectives. The second letter went to my father and my brother, the same letter to each, mailed the same day. I knew if I told them in person, the room would happen to me again, the glasses would come off, the sadness would deploy, and 11 years of training would drag me back into my chair. On paper, there is no room. On paper, a pause can last as long as the reader needs it to. The letter said, in almost exactly these words, "For 11 years I have paid Dean's rent and related costs. I've loved doing right by this family, and I need you both to hear that. As of September 30th, the payments will stop. I have notified Crestline that I'm ending the lease guarantee on the same date, so Dean has 3 full months to plan. This isn't punishment, and it isn't a negotiation. It's just the end of an arrangement that was supposed to last a few months and lasted 11 years. I love you both. Adele." No total, no spreadsheet, no accounting of wrongs, no mention of the dinner, no requirement that anyone admit anything. I have thought a lot about why I kept the letter so bare, and it comes down to this. I did not want them to argue with my reasons, because reasons can be argued with. A reason invites a rebuttal. A decision just sits there. I dropped both envelopes at the post office on Monday morning before work, and my hands were steady. And then I sat in my parked car for 10 minutes because my legs were not. Dean called me first, 2 days later, which surprised me. It was the strangest call of my life and one of the shortest. He was quiet for a while and then he said, "I probably should have been the one to end it, huh?" Not an apology exactly. Adjacent to one. He said the letter scared him, and then he said, "But honestly, Del, it's kind of like finding out the test date. You know it's coming, you finally start studying." That's my brother in one sentence, and I laughed, and it was the first real laugh between us in years. My father did not call. My father, instead, invited everyone to Sunday dinner. Pot roast. The good tablecloth. Aunt Charlene and Walt. You can see the board being set. So could I went anyway, because the whole point of everything I had done was that I was through avoiding rooms, and Desmond came, and we left Wren with his mother, on purpose. And it went almost exactly the way I knew it would, right up until the moment it didn't. Dinner was pleasant and wrong, like a smile with something behind it, and my father waited, he actually waited until the cobbler. I could almost admire the stagecraft. And then he set down his fork and took off his glasses and folded them. I felt 11 years of my body's training fire at once, the heat in my face, the apology rising in my throat like a reflex. And he looked down the table at me with all that rehearsed sorrow and he said, "I got your letter." He let that sit. Then he said, "I never thought a child of Louise's would put a dollar figure on her own family." And then he said it. The sentence he had been saying for 11 years, the sentence this whole story hangs on, word for word the same as that Tuesday night when I stood stirring chili with a phone against my ear. He said, "Your mother would want us to take care of each other." And this time, something extraordinary happened, which is that nothing happened. The sentence landed and I watched it land, almost from outside myself, the way you can watch a wave come at you at the beach and just, for once, plant your feet. I didn't shake. I didn't cry. I put my napkin next to my plate and I looked at my father and I said, "You're right, Dad." She would. And she'd also want somebody to take care of me. She'd want somebody, one time in 11 years, to ask if I was okay. Nobody has, not once. Not you, not Dean, not anyone at this table. So I asked myself. The room had gone absolutely silent, the specific silence I told you about at the start, and into it I said the number. I said $61,400. That's what taking care of each other has cost me since Mom died, and I know it to the dollar because counting things is what I do. Daddy, you have never once had to count it because it was never yours. I said, the payment stops September 30th. Dean already knows, and Dean is going to be fine, and I'd bet on him before I'd bet on most people. I said, I'm not angry, and I'm not leaving this family, and I will be at this table every Sunday you'll have me. But this subject is closed. It is not up for discussion tonight, and it will not be up for discussion at Christmas. And if it gets raised again, I will get my coat and kiss you on the head and go home and come back the next Sunday like nothing happened. And then, and this was somehow the hardest part, I stopped talking. I did not soften it. I did not apologize for it. I did not fill the silence. I just passed the cobbler to Walt, whose face, I will treasure forever, looked like a man watching weather change. My father tried twice more that night, and I want to tell you about both, because they were so different from each other. The first try was the old machinery, Charlene. Tell her. Your sister never counted dollars, and Aunt Charlene, God bless her, surprised the whole room. She was quiet a second and then said, actually, Sherman, Louise counted everything. She kept a ledger in the pantry. Where do you think Adele gets it? And she looked at me and added, softly, your mama would have put a stop to this years ago. Sugar. And I had to look very hard at the tablecloth for a minute. You spend 11 years believing the room will always side against you. Sometimes the room was just waiting for you to go first. The second try came later at the sink, and it wasn't a try at all, really. Everyone else was in the den, and my father came and stood beside me while I washed the roasting pan in my mother's old spot, and for a long time he said nothing. Then he said, very low, not in the speech voice, in a voice I hadn't heard since the hospital, you know what I'm scared of, Del, he said. When your mama died, I could feel this family coming apart like a wet paper bag, and I couldn't fix it. I can't fix anything. I fixed inventory for 30 years, and I couldn't fix one thing that mattered. And keeping you kids tied together, the money, the Sundays that felt like the only string I had. If nobody needs anything from anybody, what's left? Who are we then? And for a moment, one real, unguarded moment, my father was not the man with the folding glasses. He was a 68-year-old widower standing where his wife used to stand, telling the truth. I put down the sponge and I said, Dad, I'm right here. The string was never the money. The string was never the money. And I watched him hear it, and I watched him almost take it. And then I watched him step back from it, the way you'd step back from a cold doorway. He cleared his throat and straightened and said, well, I still think you could have come to me before sending letters like some attorney. And he picked up a dish towel, and that was the end of the moment. That's the truth of it. If you're waiting for the scene where he weeps and sees it all, I don't have one, and I promised you the truth. Some people show you their whole heart for 8 seconds a decade, and you learn to be grateful for the 8 seconds and to stop billing them for the rest. He did dry the dishes, though, all of them standing next to me in silence. From my father, that is nearly a treaty. The last payment went out September 1st. I made it myself, on time, in full, the 132nd, and I'm glad the last one was on time, because it meant the ending was mine and clean. On September 30th, my guarantee ended, and Crestline sent the confirmation letter, which is in my filing cabinet, in a folder I labeled, with a straight face, closed accounts. And now the part of the story where I get to tell you what happened after, which is the part these stories usually rush, and I refuse to rush it, because this is where the actual ending lies. Dean did not land on his feet in a montage. October and November were genuinely hard for him. His income didn't qualify for the Crestline renewal on his own, which he'd known was coming for 3 months. And to his real credit, he had spent those months doing something about it instead of waiting for a rescue. He picked up a second shift at the parts store. He sold a motorcycle that had not run since the previous owner of this story's guilt was still alive. He got denied by 2 apartment complexes and told me about it himself, on the phone, voice flat but steady. Both times I gripped the edge of my kitchen counter and did not offer money. If you have ever loved someone through the exact struggle you spent years preventing, you know that gripping the counter is its own full-time job. In December, he was approved for a studio apartment on the north side. Smaller, further out, $690 a month, every dollar of it his. He texted me a photo of the signed lease the day it happened. No caption, just the photo. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot and cried, in a way I had not let myself cry once, during the 11 years I was the one paying. He has paid it himself for over a year now. Last spring, he was made assistant manager. At Easter, he handed Ren $20 for her savings jar with a wink and said, "Don't spend it on rent." My brother made a joke about it. I cannot tell you what that meant. The joke meant the shame had aired out enough to touch. People can grow, is the thing. Sometimes the kindest years we give them are the ones standing between them and the growing. And my father and me, we are, in a word I've made peace with, fine. I go to Sunday dinner 2 or 3 times a month. He calls about Ren's school and his blood pressure and whether Desmond can look at the gutters, and Desmond looks at the gutters. Dad has never apologized, and I have stopped listing that in my ledger of things owed, because that ledger is closed too. Twice since that night he has drifted toward the old subject. A sigh, a certain wind-up I know by heart. Families these days, everybody keeping score. And both times I did exactly what I said I would do. The first time I said, "Dad," and just looked at him, and he found somewhere else to take the sentence. The second time, last Thanksgiving, he pushed one step further, and I got up and kissed him on the head and got my coat and said, "See you Sunday," and left, calm as a bank teller. I was back the next Sunday like nothing happened. There has not been a third time. It turns out you only have to prove a boundary is real about twice. The proving is terrible, and then it is over, and what's left is oddly gentle. My father and I talk more easily now than we did in the paying years, and I think it's because resentment takes up an enormous amount of room in a conversation, and mine finally had somewhere else to live. The number, by the way, stays at 61,400. It will stay there forever, the total of a closed account, and here's what I know about it now, standing on this side of it that I couldn't have known before. I don't regret every dollar. The first year of it, honestly, I'd pay again. My brother was drowning and family threw him a rope, and that rope was worth what it cost. What I regret is that nobody, including me, ever checked whether the man could swim yet. He absolutely could. For about 10 years, he could, and none of us, not my father, not me, ever once stopped to actually ask. If this story found you at the right time, before you go, do 2 things for me. First, subscribe if you haven't, because I tell one of these true stories every week, stories about the quiet kind of strength, and I'd love to have you here for the next one. Second, and this one matters more to me, go down to the comments and tell me about the boundary you've been meaning to set with your own family. The payment, the holiday, the phone call, the role you got handed at somebody's funeral and never got to hand back. Say it in writing, even just in a comment, because I am living proof that things get truer when you put them in writing. I'll be in the comments tonight, reading. Before I let you go, let me leave you with what those 11 years actually taught me, because I paid a great deal of tuition for these lessons, and they should belong to somebody besides me. An arrangement without an end date is not a favor. It is a job you never applied for. Nobody ever asked me for 11 years. They asked me for a few months, and then simply never asked again, and the silence did the rest. 132 payments went out because ending the thing would have required a conversation, and continuing it required nothing at all. That's the trap to watch for, in your family and in your own habits. If you are helping someone and the words end date have never been spoken out loud, speak them this month, while the help is still a gift. A gift with no ending quietly becomes a salary, and a salary quietly becomes a debt that you, somehow, are the one who owes. The person who benefits from your sacrifice is not always the person who demanded it. Dean took my money for 11 years, and Dean never once asked me for $1. Every request came through my father, who never took a cent, and if I had aimed my anger at the obvious target, my brother, I would have burned the one relationship in this story that was actually salvageable. It was Sherman who built the arrangement, and Sherman who enforced it, and grief that he was hiding inside it the whole time. Before you go to war with the hand that holds the money, look up the arm and find out whose fear is moving it. The answer will change what you do next, and it might save someone worth saving. You do not need anyone to validate your accounting, but you do need to do the accounting. That spreadsheet never won an argument, and it was never meant to, and it was still the hinge of my whole life. $61,400 sat invisible inside 132 reasonable little payments, until I put it in one cell and looked at it. Only then could I trust myself against a room full of people telling me it was small. Whatever your version is, the years, the holidays hosted, the appointments driven to, count it, privately, honestly, just once on paper. Not to show them. To show you. You cannot hold a line you have never actually seen. The door does not have to slam to be a door. Everyone who has never done this imagines 2 endings, cave in forever or walk out forever, and the whole secret is that both of those are the easy ways because both of them end the discomfort. I chose the hard third thing, the same chair at the same table with the checkbook closed. It cost me 2 terrible dinners, and it bought me my father back, the real 68-year-old man, not the role we were both performing. He never apologized, and Dean pays his own rent, and I show up on Sundays, and all three of those things are true at once, and that is what peace actually came to look like. So if you're sitting where I sat, at a kitchen table at midnight with a number only you can see, hear this from someone on the other side of it. You are allowed to stop. You can do it without hating anyone, and without a speech, and without their permission, and the people worth keeping will still be there after the silence passes. Mine were. I'm okay. And the first of this month, like every month now, the money stayed home.